When to the sessions of sweet silent thought I summon up remembrance of things past, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new wail my dear time's waste. Then can I drown an eye, unused to flow for precious friends hid in death's dateless night, and weep afresh love's long since cancelled woe, and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. Then can I grieve at grievances foregone, and heavily from woe to woe tell o'er the sad account of full bemoaned moan, which I knew pay as if not paid before. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored, and sorrows end. That, of course, is the famous Sonnet 30, written by one of the most famous writers ever. Even, like over 400 years later, I am, of course, referring to the very famous William Shakespeare. Now, before we go any further, let's get something straight. It's been a huge discussion point for years now as to whether Shakespeare wrote his own plays. The basis of that argument has a lot to do with this misconception that Shakespeare was this, poor farmer boy. Now, firstly, I don't know why Americans are so obsessed with this theory, especially considering they are the country that are huge on, an underdog story and people going from rags to riches. But regardless, Shakespeare was by no means extremely poor. He, in fact, was a decently wealthy lad. Of course, he was no nobleman, but this is what his house in Stratford upon Avon looked like. This is where our poor little farmer boy grew up. Of course, Stratford was not London. However, his upbringing clearly influences his works. So there are, the landscape around Stratford has influenced his work. If you look at some of his pieces, there are hundreds of references towards, like plants in his works. For example, in Midsummer Night's Dream, Oberon says, "I know a bank where the wild thyme blows, where oxlips and the nodding violet grows, quite over canopied with luscious woodbine, with sweet musk roses, and with eglantine, where sleeps Titania sometime of the night." That's just an example of how maybe his upbringing in Stratford has influenced his work. But with this as well, his father was a glove maker, which was a decent profession, and he was also a sheep/wool smuggler, but let's not dive too deeply into that. And he was also, his father, of course, was a town councillor, a sought-after position in the town. Now, along with this, Shakespeare had a phenomenal education. He was a part of the generation that was the most literate up to that point in history. Queen Elizabeth, in her reign, built 160 new schools and focused on educating the youth. The classes they took as well were much tougher than most classes we tend to take today. They would recite Latin verses and do extensive readings. And Shakespeare was known to have some of his favorite books as well, which definitely influenced a lot of his work later in his career. They also definitely had a deep education in theatre, regularly doing shows, etc. They had shows up in the town as well, religious plays mainly. So that's how mainly Shakespeare got into his theatre life. Now, of course, it would be an immense oversight to not mention that this is a poetry class, and of course I will be mentioning Shakespeare's sonnets in a brief second, but that is not where he started. He started with his plays and the Lord's Chamberlain Men. This was his theatre troupe, with actors such as Richard Burbage, William Camp, etc., etc. The first play that happened, that Shakespeare wrote, is kind of like widely, a topic for discussion amongst Shakespeare buffs. Some people think it's Henry IV, some think it's Taming of the Shrew, whatever you may think. But one that was one of his first and one of his most famous, one that regularly gets redone, maybe not so much now, but was famously one of the most popularly done and bought when it was released as a book. I'm referring to right now Richard III. So this is the opening, Act 1, Scene 1 of Richard III. Now is this glorious. Now is the winter of our discontent made glorious summer by this son of York. And I wanted to briefly bring up this piece here because I think it's kind of a good show of some of the things that Shakespeare does with his language. So the language in this piece alone is something to marvel at. There's so many puns, so many beautiful images used throughout, and it kind of shows why Shakespeare's writing has survived for such a long time. There's a multitude of reasons, but one of the main reasons is the beauteous images that he uses in his pieces. I mean, this is a great one to look at, as we get to kind of see how Shakespeare wrote a lot of his work. So I'll pull up my little pointer, and we can see here there's some run-on lines as well. Obviously, it should be mentioned that the two main ways that Shakespeare wrote in was prose and verse, prose being more like typical dialogue. So if you think of a passage like I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercises, and indeed it goes, what a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty. From Act 2, Scene 2 of Hamlet, that's written completely in prose. There isn't an iambic pentameter in there, but what the majority of his plays are, or at least for most of it, I know Much Ado is mainly prose, but for ones that generally are the history plays or a lot of the tragedies are mainly written in verse, blank verse, which is what we see here, iambic pentameter. So you can see that there are usually 10 syllables per line. We've gone over iambic pentameter in class, but it's great to look upon it. Shakespeare using it in his work. So obviously this isn't a good example because the stress is now on this first foot, but now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the son of York. So we can see there the lovely iambic pentameter coming through, and as an actor it's a really great tool that we get to use. Here you can also see the use of run-on lines with strong line endings, but also a lot of the time there will be some punctuation at the end of lines, and we'll see this a little bit more in his sonnets. But instead of me trying to go line by line and explain the beautiful images in this piece here, I have a brief clip of Sir Ian McKellen talking about this little monologue here and him explaining just the first two lines, and I want to show that because Sir Ian McKellen is obviously one of the greatest Shakespeare actors of all time. So let's take a quick look at that.
So, now, what a wonderful first word, right at the beginning of the play. Now. Not in the past, not a history play, now. So what's going to happen now? Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer. Now is the winter of our discontent. Well, we've been having a terrible time in England. The discontent has led to civil wars, and Richard is suggesting that feels like winter, when everything's rather uncomfortable. But now it's glorious summer because the sun has come out. But here we are. Here's a pun. Sun is a pun. It means two things. It means the sun in the sky, but the son of York is the S-O-N. And the child of York, and the house of York, who have been fighting in the civil wars. And so here Richard's referring to his elder brother, Edward, Duke of York, who's now become King Edward IV.
What a great man. Yeah, just going over two brief lines. I mean, they're not terribly hard to understand, but we can see in the opening, this is the opening scene of Richard III, and you can see already that there is a pun in there, and you see this constantly across Shakespeare's language, uses of puns, all this fun stuff, and it just is a really great showcase of how great he's an actor. Now, a quick segue here, so I'm going to talk about sorry, Mr. McKellen. We're going to go to his success. So it would be an understatement to say that people loved Shakespeare's work. I mean, it was a very, very popular form. They had huge popularity amongst in England at the time because theatre was kind of going through a rough spot at that time. So, I mean, public, shows and stuff like that weren't really a thing that they are like now today, where you see theatres all across the country here in the United States. In fact, the Globe was purposely built south of the Thames because if it wasn't, then it wouldn't be allowed because of the laws that were in place at the time. So anyone who wanted to go watch a show, the Globe was one of the main places that they would go. And then the Blackfriars when it eventually got opened a couple of years later. But with that as well, there's a range of Shakespeare plays that he wrote appealing to the masses. Obviously, there's the comedies that usually the groundlings would like, but also the tragedies. the tragedies would touch the heartstrings of the general public as well, and they often would have comedy in them as well. Like in Romeo and Juliet, some people like to say that the first half is more so like a comedy with Mercutio, Benvolio, Romeo sort of kicking around in this sort of beautiful love story, and then when Mercutio dies and Tybalt dies, then it really turns into that tragedy and everything goes south and it gets really depressing. So that's a great showcase. That play is a great showcase of Shakespeare's writing and how he lures you in with love and comedy and then kind of kills you at the end with the tragedy. But with this as well, it wasn't just the masses that loved Shakespeare's work. Nobles loved it too. So the Lords Chamberlain's men, which was Shakespeare's troupe, they became the king's men when King Henry, King James the First became king in 1603. Because he loved them so much and he had such a love for the arts. So the king's men would regularly perform for the king, usually during the winter seasons when the globe couldn't be open. So it shows that, theatre was kind of seen as this great thing, mainly to do with Shakespeare and the writing that he did. It was a really great thing for theatre at the time, and everyone from the groundlings all the way to the noblemen were known to love his play. Now, as the theory goes, a few years into his career, there was a plague outbreak in London. This is just a theory. Obviously, we don't have all the information on Shakespeare, unfortunately, but the theory is that with the plague, it momentarily shut down London and business for the bard, and limiting, the outdoors life and obviously, therefore, the globe. So, it is thus believed that Shakespeare started devising his sonnets. The sonnets are devised in two major parts. The first bit believed to be addressed to a man, or a boy, and the second bit believed to be addressed to the dark lady. Now we'll look back at that sonnet that I beautifully read for you at the start of this presentation, Sonnet 30. Now we all know that the form of a Shakespeare sonnet with this class. It's an English sonnet as well, devised by Wyatt and Surrey. Unlike Robert Browning, who is known to mute his rhymes, Shakespeare is known to sort of emphasize them in his sonnets, with a lot of punctuation marks coming at the end of sentences, emphasizing the rhyming word, giving it this further melodic feel. It should also be noted that Shakespeare is pretty strict about the iambic pentameter, so the first line, when to the sessions of sweet, silent thought I summon up remembrance of things past, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new wail my dear time's waste. So very kind of strict with that, creating this very melodic feel. And you'll notice in this poem, most of the lines end with punctuation marks, sort of emphasizing the rhyming word. One poem that isn't like this, one sonnet that isn't like this, which is interesting, is 116, one of the very famous ones that people love. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when its alteration finds, or bends when the remover to remove. So that whole little bit there is just one sentence, really, with only like one or two punctuation marks. But here we'll see, along with Sonnet 18, the famous one, Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, almost every single line in that poem also has a punctuation mark at the end. However, what's interesting about this as well is we see another way that Shakespeare writes. So you'll notice the first full stop that comes in here, if I am correct, is right all the way down here. Now there are some semicolons, which technically mean like breaks in sentences, I guess, but the fact that this technically is all one long sentence kind of shows a way that Shakespeare tends to write, with this sort of the speaker is always coming up with these ideas on the fly. When you are performing Shakespeare, you have to perform it like this very quickly, kind of acting like you're coming up with all these things while you're saying it, So, went to the sessions of sweet silent thought, I summon up remembrance of things past. I sigh the lack of many a thing I saw, and with old woes my new wail my dear time's waste. Then can I drown an eye? That's a new thought. Unused to flow, adding in, like, I'm not used to it. For precious friends hid in death's stateless night, and weep afresh love's long since cancelled woe, and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. Still not the end of sentence. It keeps going, right? And we see this constantly in the piece I mentioned earlier. What a piece of work is man. That what a piece of work is man is technically one whole sentence, and I think that's very interesting in his writing, how he kind of just goes along, and there's constantly added thoughts within the lines, and yet technically it's not the end of the thought. So there will be one single thought, but then in the writing there'll be like an argument against the thought, or like new things added to the thought. And I think that's one of my favorite parts about his writing, sort of getting in your mind as you perform Shakespeare. I think it's really great. So yes, I think a great example of this, of what I'm talking about, is Hamlet's monologue from Act 2, Scene 2. It is very long, so I'm not going to go through it all. But here we see, you'll see in this first bit here, this is all just one long sentence again. Is it not monstrous that this player here, but in a fiction, in a dream of passion, could force his soul so to his own conceit that from her working all his visage wand, tears in his eyes, distraction in his aspect, a broken voice, and his whole function suiting with forms to his conceit, and all for nothing. All one sentence, and yet it is so interesting because you can see sort of the thoughts break down throughout the sentence. Everything that is in Shakespeare, because of the globe, it's this big roundabout thing. You can't really see the actors well. So everything they are thinking is all kind of dictated usually. And I think that's a really interesting part about his writing. And we see that in the sonnets as well, which I think is really, really great. I just love this piece. I think it's a really, really great monologue. So long as well. And the growth here, how you see this in the sonnets as well with the turns at the end. He's hitting on himself here. A Scullion fire upon it foe about my brains. Suddenly there's a switch and it's quick. I've heard that guilty creatures at a play have, by the very cunning of the scene, been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. For murder, though I have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organ. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before mine uncle. You see, he's discovering it. Hamlet is discovering what he's saying as he's saying it. And I think it is such a masterclass in writing. And I think it's something that really separates Shakespeare from a lot of the other writers at the time. And also the imagery that he uses to portray these things. I have to go back here, but if you look... I can't go back, unfortunately, but the line where it's he's talking about, I should have fatted all the region kites with their slaves offal. That's such an interesting image to use in your writing. I should have fatted, so fed, or fatted all the region kites, so all these birds, fatted meaning like fed them with this slave's offal, his intestines, right? It's such a vulgar image to portray how much Hamlet, hates his uncle, hates the king. It just drives him to just such this ugly image. And I think Shakespeare's writing is just phenomenal. And I apologize for the messiness of me when I get very excited about Shakespeare, but he is one of the greatest writers ever. And I think this last bit also is such an amazing bit as well, where he goes, I know my course. The spirit that I have seen may be the devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape, yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. I'll have grounds more relative than this. He's thinking about everything. He's thinking about, the spirit that I have seen. It might be the devil, right? And, the devil has this power to, assume shapes and ghosts, and maybe he's doing this to get back at me, but I'll have grounds more relative than this. You're hearing every single part of Hamlet's mind, and I think that's one of the really resounding parts of Shakespeare's writing. Thank you very much. That is the end of my presentation. I hope you enjoyed. William Shakespeare is phenomenal. His sonnets are beautiful, and there is a very distinct reason as to why his writing has lasted this long. It's not just because of the beautiful imagery, but also constantly we see throughout his pieces very relatable human aspects and themes. In the sonnets, most of them are about love, which is something people still go through and struggle with today. And in Hamlet, revenge, all these themes are still very, very potent in today's society. Thank you.